I watched my daughter-in-law toss my granddaughter's favorite blanket into the trash like it was toxic waste. I didn't know then that the fabric was hiding a secret that would breathe life back into a cold murder case. My name is Elowen, and at 69 years old, I have learned that the silence of a house is often louder than any scream, especially when that silence is built upon the bones of a lie you were never supposed to uncover. For 3 years, I lived in the shadow of a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, a constant reminder of the Tuesday afternoon when the world stopped spinning and my only son, Caden, was taken from me in what the police called a tragic, unavoidable accident. Caden was a man of light, a dedicated surgeon who spent his days mending hearts and his evenings warming mine. Yet he died on a rain-slicked pavement while his wife, Sienna, watched from the window of their suburban home, her face a mask of practiced horror that I was too blinded by tears to see through. I remember the funeral, the way the wind whipped through the graveyard and how Sienna stood there in her designer black veil, looking every bit the grieving widow while she clutched their infant daughter, Mila, to her chest. But even then, there was a coldness in her eyes that didn't match the salt on her cheeks. Since that day, I have been a ghost in my own life, visiting their home only to see Mila, the living image of a father who isn't there to watch her grow. But the tension between Sienna and me has grown into a wall of ice that no amount of forced pleasantry could melt. It all came to a breaking point on a humid Thursday afternoon when I arrived unannounced to drop off some groceries, only to find Sienna dragging heavy black industrial trash bags to the curb with a frantic, desperate energy that didn't sit right with my soul. I watched from my car, hidden by the overgrown hedge of the neighbor's yard, as she shoved a bundle of mint green fabric into the depths of the bin with a violence that made me flinch. It was the hand-wear-upon blanket I had spent for months making for Mila when she was born, a labor of love that Caden used to wrap around his daughter every single night. The moment Sienna's sleek SUV pulled out of the driveway and disappeared around the corner, I was out of my car, my elderly joints protesting as I scrambled toward the trash bin, driven by a primal need to rescue that one tangible connection to my son's memory. When I reached in and pulled the blanket out, it felt unnaturally heavy, smelling faintly of a perfume Sienna hadn't worn in years and something metallic. Something sharp that pricked at the back of my mind. I didn't stop to think, I didn't look back. I drove home with the blanket clutched in my lap, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Once inside the safety of my kitchen, I spread the fabric across the table, my fingers tracing the intricate stitches until they hit a hard, rectangular lump sewn deep within the double-layered batting near the corner. My breath hitched as I realized this wasn't a mistake in the knitting or a clump of forgotten wool. Someone had intentionally opened the seam and buried something inside, stitching it back up with a jagged, hurried thread that didn't belong to me. With shaking hands, I retrieved my old sewing scissors, the silver blades glinting in the afternoon sun, and began to snip away at the fibers, each pop of the thread sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. As the fabric gave way, a small, black burner phone tumbled out onto the wood, its screen cracked but its presence looming like a dark omen. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my mind racing through 1,000 impossible scenarios, wondering why my son's widow would hide a disposable phone inside a child's blanket and then try to throw it away 3 years later. When I finally found the courage to press the power button, the screen flickered to life with a low battery warning, revealing a wallpaper that shattered my remaining sanity. It wasn't a picture of Mila or Caden, but a candid, intimate photo of Sienna laughing in the arms of a man I had never seen before, a man with dark, predatory eyes and a smile that didn't reach his brow. I began to scroll through the messages, my vision blurring as I read words of passion and conspiracy, realizing that while I was mourning my son, Sienna was planning a life with his replacement. But the deeper I went, the darker the messages became. They spoke of the plan, of the timing, and of a clean break that had nothing to do with divorce and everything to do with the insurance policy that had cleared Sienna's debts within months of Caden's funeral. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine as I realized that the accident wasn't a twist of fate, but a choreographed execution. And the very blanket I had made to keep my granddaughter warm had been used as a hiding place for the blueprints of my son's murder. I sat there in the fading light, the phone heavy in my hand, knowing that I couldn't go to the police yet because Sienna had friends in high places, and I was just a grieving grandmother with a history of forgetfulness she had carefully documented to discredit me. I looked at the blanket, once a symbol of love, now a shroud for the truth, and I realized that my quiet life was over. I was no longer just a survivor of tragedy, I was a hunter of justice, and I would not rest until the woman who stole my son's breath felt the walls of her lies closing in around her. The realization hit me then that Mila was still in that house, living with a monster who could discard a life as easily as a piece of cloth, and the urgency of my mission became a fire in my veins. I had to be smart, I had to be silent. And I had to find out who the man in the photo was before Sienna realized the phone was missing and came looking for the evidence that could send her to death row. Every creak of my old house felt like a footstep, every shadow like a threat. But as I looked at the photo of Caden on the mantel, his eyes seemed to urge me forward, promising that the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to the surface. As the screen flickered to life, I realized I hadn't just found a phone. I had found the blueprint for my son's execution. The first photo I saw wasn't of my son or his child. It was a picture of my daughter-in-law in the arms of a stranger, taken on the very day she told Caden she was working a double shift at the hospital. The blue light of the burner phone screen felt like a laser cutting through the darkness of my kitchen. And as the minutes bled into hours, I felt the very fabric of my reality beginning to unravel, thread by agonizing thread. I sat there, a woman of 69 whose only crime was loving her family too much, staring at the evidence of a betrayal so calculated it made my skin crawl with a cold, visceral revulsion. The gallery of that hidden phone was a digital graveyard of my son's happiness. Every image was a dagger to my heart, showing Sienna the woman Caden had worshipped, the woman I had welcomed into our family with open arms, sharing intimate, laughing moments with a man whose face was a map of arrogance and cruelty. His name, I would later discover through the jagged trail of their messages, was Rowan, a man who looked like he had never worked an honest day in his life. And yet he was the one Sienna had chosen over my brilliant, kind-hearted Caden. The photos were time-stamped, a chronological record of infidelity that made me physically sick. There were pictures of them at beach resorts when Sienna claimed to be at medical conferences, and selfies of them in bed while Caden was home caring for a colicky Mila. But the photos were merely the surface of the abyss. The text messages were the true descent into hell. I read through their exchanges with a morbid, shaking fascination, my eyes burning as I saw them discuss my son not as a husband or a father, but as an obstacle, a paycheck, and a problem that needed solving. Sienna's messages were devoid of the sweetness she performed for me. She was sharp, manipulative, and fueled by a greed that seemed to have no bottom. On the day Caden died, there was a message from Rowan at 2:14 p.m., just an hour before the accident, that simply said, "The stage is set. Just make sure he's where he's supposed to be." To which Sienna replied with a chillingly casual, "He's already on his way. Don't miss." My breath hitched in my throat as I realized I was reading a murder confession in real time. The accident on the stairs, the slip on the wet pavement, it was all a lie. They had lured him to his death, likely for the massive life insurance policy I had seen him sign just months before his passing. A policy Sienna had been so eager to collect. I felt like a ghost myself, wandering through the memories of the last 3 years, seeing every tear Sienna shed at the funeral as a victory lap, every hug she gave me as a way to check if my heart was still beating or if I was getting closer to the truth. I began to download the messages to a secure cloud drive, my fingers flying over the cracked screen despite the tremors in my hands, knowing that if Sienna realized this phone was gone, she would come for me with the same cold efficiency she used on my son. I thought about Mila, sleeping in that house of horrors, being raised by a woman who had orchestrated her father's execution, and a new kind of terror took hold of me, a terror that was quickly replaced by a white-hot, grandmotherly rage. I spent the rest of the night digging deeper into Rowan's digital footprint, finding links to shady construction firms and offshore accounts that suggested this wasn't their first time playing this game. The deeper I went, the more I realized that Caden wasn't just a victim of a cheating wife. He was a victim of a professional predator. The phone also contained audio recordings Sienna must have kept them as leverage against Rowan, and when I pressed play on the first one, I heard my son's voice in the background, muffled and happy, calling out that he loved her, followed by Sienna's whispered voice into the phone saying, "He's so oblivious, Rowan. It's almost too easy. Just do what we agreed and we can finally leave this pathetic life behind." Hearing Caden's voice, so full of life and trust, mere moments before his world ended, broke something inside me that can never be mended. I realized then that I couldn't just go to the local police. The lead detective on Caden's case had been a close friend of Sienna's father, and the investigation had been closed with suspicious haste. I was alone in this fight, a grandmother against a murderer and her lover, armed only with a discarded blanket and a burner phone full of ghosts. I spent the early morning hours mapping out their movements, realizing they had been careful to never be seen together in our small town, meeting instead in cheap motels and darkened parking lots. But they had been sloppy in their arrogance. They thought they had won. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, accusing shadows across my kitchen floor, I knew I had to become someone I didn't recognize: a strategist, a spy, a protector. I would play the part of the grieving, dotage-stricken grandmother a little longer, watching Sienna from the corners of my eyes, waiting for the moment she slipped up. I had to find out where the money went, why they hadn't fled yet, and what other secrets were buried in the foundation of that house. But as I scrolled to the very bottom of the messages, past the plots and the lust, I found a single, unsent draft that made my heart stop entirely. It was a message from Sienna to an unknown number that read, "The old woman is starting to ask too many questions about the night of the accident. I think it's time she joins Caden." The realization that I was now in their crosshairs didn't scare me. It solidified my resolve. I would not be another victim in their quest for a clean break. I would be the storm that tore their house of cards down. And I would do it for Caden, for the truth, and for the little girl who had no idea she was living with a wolf. But as I scrolled to the very bottom of the messages, I found a note that suggested my son wasn't the only person Sienna had made disappear to get what she wanted. I always wondered why Mila didn't look like anyone in our family. When I found the birth certificate hidden in Sienna's closet, I realized it was because she wasn't a member of our family at all. The air in my small living room felt stagnant, heavy with the weight of the documents Alara and I had spread across the coffee table like the pieces of a shattered soul. My hands, once steady enough to knit delicate lace, now trembled so violently that the paper rattled in my grip as I stared at the manila envelope Alara had liberated from Sienna's master closet. Inside was the $500,000 life insurance policy, a blood-soaked fortune that Sienna had collected a mere 3 months after Caden's funeral. A payday for a murder she had choreographed with the chilling precision of a stage play. But it was the bank statements that turned my blood to ice, documenting a series of massive transfers totaling $200,000 to an account held by Rowan, the rugged stranger from the burner phone. It was the price of a life, the literal cost of my son's execution, paid out in cold, digital increments to the man who helped her throw Caden down those stairs. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me as I realized that every time Sienna had hugged me and wept about her financial struggles after the accident, she was likely laughing internally while her lover's bank account swelled with my son's legacy. Yet, as horrific as the financial betrayal was, it paled in comparison to the single sheet of paper that sat at the very bottom of the stack, a copy of a birth certificate for my granddaughter, Mila. I looked at the document, waiting for the name Sienna to jump out at me, but it never did. Instead, the space for the mother's name was occupied by a woman I had never heard of, Vesper Thorne. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the realization took hold. Isabella, the girl I called Mila, was not Sienna's daughter, and by extension, she was not my biological granddaughter. My mind raced back to the month Sienna claimed to be pregnant, remembering the loose clothing, the sudden complications that kept her away from family gatherings, and the suspiciously early birth that she claimed was a medical emergency. The birth certificate in my hand was dated to full months before Mila was supposed to have entered our lives, a discrepancy that ripped the final veil from Sienna's elaborate facade. She hadn't just stolen a life, she had stolen a human being to complete her perfect family image, a trophy to secure Caden's devotion and eventually his assets. Driven by a desperate, frantic energy, I turned to my laptop, my fingers flying over the keys as I searched for the name Vesper Thorne. It didn't take long for the digital ghosts to appear. A series of local news articles from 4 years ago chronicled the disappearance of a 23-year-old mother who had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a 2-month-old infant. There was a photo of Vesper, a girl with soft, sad eyes and dark hair that looked hauntingly similar to the curls Mila now wore. My heart broke for this stranger as I read about the search parties and the grieving family she left behind. But the real horror was found in a more recent update from just 6 months ago. The remains of a young woman had been found in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city, identified through dental records as Vesper Thorne. The cause of death listed in the report made me drop the laptop. Blunt force trauma to the head, the exact same accidental cause of death that had been stamped on my son's autopsy. Sienna hadn't just met Rowan and decided to kill Caden. She was a serial predator who had likely targeted Vesper for her child, murdered her to remove any claim, and then used the baby to trap my son in a web of lies. My son had loved a ghost child, and he had died protecting a woman who was a walking graveyard of secrets. I looked at Alara, her face a mask of terror that mirrored my own, and I knew we had crossed a line from which there was no returning. We weren't just investigating a cheating spouse anymore. We were hunting a double murderer who was currently tucking a stolen child into bed. Every second Mila spent in that house was a second she was in the hands of the woman who had killed both her biological mother and the man she believed was her father. I felt a primal, grandmotherly instinct take over, a fire that burned away the last of my grief and left only a cold, hard resolve to see Sienna behind bars or in the ground. I grabbed the burner phone, the insurance papers, and the birth certificate, shoving them into my bag with hands that were finally, for the first time in years, perfectly still. My son was dead, a young mother was missing, and the child I had loved as my own was a trophy of a double homicide. The detective looked at me with a pity that made me want to scream. He said the case was closed, until I handed him the burner phone and told him to look at the date of the accident again. The heavy, metallic scent of the police station, a mixture of old coffee floor wax, and the stale air of bureaucracy seemed to cling to my clothes as I sat in the lobby with Alara, clutching the manila envelope like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. For 3 years, the world had viewed me as a fragile, grieving grandmother, a woman whose mind was perhaps softening with age and sorrow. But as I sat across from Detective Silas Thorne, I felt sharper than a surgical blade. Silas was a man who carried his years in the deep lines around his eyes that initially held a gentle, patronizing kindness when I began to speak. He told me that my son's case had been thoroughly investigated, that the accident was a closed chapter of a rainy Tuesday, and that reopening it would only bring me more pain. I let him finish his scripted condolences, and then, with a hand that didn't tremble, I placed the small, black burner phone on his desk. I watched his expression shift from pity to professional curiosity as I explained where I had found it sewn into the heart of a child's blanket, and as I pointed to the specific date of the final text message from Sienna's lover, Rowan. It wasn't just a message. It was a timestamp for a murder, sent exactly 12 minutes before the first emergency call was placed from Sienna's house. I watched Silas's eyes scan the digital gallery, the images of Sienna and Rowan in their stolen moments of passion and conspiracy reflecting in his pupils. The silence in the small, cramped office became absolute as he reached the audio files I had uncovered. The ones where Sienna's voice, cold and stripped of its wifely devotion, spoke of making Caden disappear for the sake of an insurance payout and a clean break. But the air truly left the room when I handed him the birth certificate we had liberated from Sienna's closet, the one belonging to Vesper Thorne. Silas froze, his pen hovering over his notepad as he stared at the name of the woman who had gone missing years ago. A woman who happened to be his own distant cousin. The connection was like an electric shock passing through him. The cold case of Vesper's disappearance suddenly had a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was located inside Sienna's home. Silas didn't call me a nosy mother-in-law after that. He called for a tech team to clone the phone and a forensic unit to pull every scrap of data from the insurance records I had provided. The investigation moved into the shadows of the city. A quiet, predatory stalking of a woman who thought she was invisible. Silas explained that we needed more than just a burner phone and a stolen document to ensure a conviction that would stick. We needed to catch them in the act of flight or find the physical evidence they thought they had buried forever. He authorized a secret surveillance of Sienna's residence, placing plainclothes officers in nondescript vans at both ends of her street. I had to return to my empty house and play the role of the unsuspecting grandmother, a task that felt like wearing a suit of lead. I would call Sienna, my voice forced into a shaky, elder softness, asking how Mila was doing, all while knowing that the child in her care was the stolen daughter of a murdered woman. Every time Sienna answered with her practiced, melodic hello, Elowen, I wanted to reach through the phone and wrap my fingers around her throat, but I held back, fueled by the knowledge that Silas was tracing every one of those calls, looking for the moment she broke character. The breakthrough came late on a Friday night when Silas called me from a burner of his own. His voice was low, urgent, and lacked its usual professional distance. He told me that the DNA results from the hair sample Alara had borrowed from Mila's brush matched the records they had on file for Vesper Thorne. The biological link was undeniable, but more importantly, the surveillance team had seen Rowan's truck pull into the driveway under the cover of a moonless sky. They weren't just visiting, they were loading the back of the vehicle with suitcases, heavy crates, and a small, pink trunk that I recognized as Mila's. They were preparing to vanish, likely tipped off by some instinct or a realization that the burner phone was truly gone. Silas told me to stay inside, to lock my doors and wait for the tactical team to move in. But as I looked at the photo of Caden on my mantle, I knew I couldn't just be a witness to the end of this story. I had to be the one to stand in their way, to see the mask fall from Sienna's face one last time before the sirens drowned out her lies. The police told me to stay away, but when I saw Rowan's truck pull into Sienna's driveway with a set of packed suitcases, I knew they were planning to vanish forever.
I didn't wait for the sirens. I drove my car across Sienna's driveway, blocking her escape, and stared into the eyes of the woman who thought she had buried the truth. The engine of my old sedan roared with a defiance I hadn't felt in years as I swung it across the entrance of the driveway, the tires screeching against the asphalt in a way that shattered the heavy silence of the neighborhood. My hands, gnarled by age and hours of gripping that mint green blanket, were locked onto the steering wheel with the strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose and an entire legacy to avenge. Through the windshield, I saw them, Sienna and Rowan, frozen like deer in the headlights of my car. They were standing by the open trunk of the truck, several heavy suitcases already loaded, and in Sienna's right hand was Mila's small, trembling hand. For a heartbeat, time seemed to suspend itself. The moonlight cut the sharp, angular planes of Sienna's face, turning her into a porcelain statue of guilt. She didn't look like the grieving widow anymore. She looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting toward the sidewalk, searching for an escape route that I had effectively severed. Rowan moved first, stepping in front of her with a protective aggression, his hand reaching toward his waistband in a gesture that made my blood run cold. But I didn't flinch. I turned off the engine, the sudden silence of the night feeling even more threatening than the noise, and I stepped out of the car, holding the original mint green blanket, the one I had rescued from the trash high like a banner of war. "You're not going anywhere, Sienna," I said, my voice projecting with a clarity that surprised even me. It wasn't the voice of a frail grandmother, it was the voice of a judge. Sienna's eyes fixed on the blanket, and I watched the realization dawn on her, the realization that her trash had returned to haunt her, that the secret phone hidden in those stitches was no longer hers to control. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "Get out of the way, Elowen. You're an old, delusional woman who's lost her mind," she spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. She tried to pull Mila toward the passenger side of the truck, but the child resisted, her small face wet with tears as she looked from her mother to me. Sensing the tectonic plates of her world shifting, Rowan stepped toward me, his voice a low growl. "Move the car, lady, or I'll move it for you." I didn't move an inch. I knew that behind the rows of darkened houses, Detective Silas and his team were closing the net, and every second I kept them talking was a second closer to justice. I looked Rowan in the eye, the man who had helped kill my son for a payout, and I felt a wave of disgust so powerful it nearly knocked me over. "I know about Vesperthorn," I said, the name hanging in the air like a death sentence. The effect was instantaneous. Rowan stopped mid-stride, his face draining of color, while Sienna let out a sharp, strangled gasp. The mention of the woman they had murdered to steal a child was the final blow to their facade. "I know Mila isn't yours. I know what you did to Caden because he found out. And I know about the insurance money you've been funneling into Rowan's accounts," I continued, my words hitting them like physical stones. Sienna's composure broke entirely. She began to scream, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed off the suburban walls, blaming Rowan for leaving the phone behind, for being sloppy, for everything that was now crashing down around them. It was the sound of a partnership built on blood and greed finally disintegrating. Just as Rowan lunged toward me, intended to shove me aside, the night was suddenly obliterated by the strobe of red and blue. A dozen police cruisers surged from the shadows, their sirens wailing a chorus of retribution as they swarmed the driveway. Officers with tactical gear and drawn weapons surrounded the truck in seconds. Silas was at the front, his face grim as he barked orders for Rowan to get on the ground. I watched as the man who thought he was so clever was pushed into the dirt, his face pressed against the gravel, while Sienna was spun around and handcuffed against the side of the truck she had hoped would take her to a new, secret life. She didn't look at Mila, she didn't look at me, she just stared at the ground, the designer black coat she wore getting stained by the oil on the driveway. I rushed forward, not for the criminals, but for the little girl standing alone in the middle of the chaos. I scooped Mila into my arms, wrapping her tightly in the mint green blanket. shielding her eyes from the sight of the woman she called mother being loaded into the back of a police car. "It's okay, my sweet girl," I whispered into her hair. "The truth is out now. You're safe." We're both safe. In the months that followed, the trial became a sensation, but I stayed away from the cameras. I watched from the gallery as the evidence from the burner phone, the texts, the audio of Caden's final moments, the photos of their betrayal sentenced both Sienna and Rowan to life without the possibility of parole. The most difficult part was the DNA confirmation that Mila was indeed the daughter of Vesper Thorne. I had to sit down with a therapist and a social worker to explain to a 4-year-old that the world she knew was built on a lie, but that the love I felt for her was the only thing that was real. I contacted Vesper's remaining family, a sister who had never stopped looking for her, and together, we decided that Mila would stay with me, the only grandmother she had ever known. While growing up with the knowledge of her true mother's identity, I started knitting a new blanket, then not one of secrets, but one of hope, using bright, vibrant colors that Caden would have loved. Justice didn't bring my son back, and it didn't bring back the years Vesper lost. But as I sit on the porch today, watching Mila run through the sprinklers, I know that the water has finally washed away the darkness. The old blanket sits in a cedar chest, a relic of a war one, while the new one keeps us warm in a future where we no longer have to be afraid of the truth. The old blanket held the secrets of a murder, but the new one I'm knitting holds the promise of a future where Mila will finally know the names of the people who truly loved her. I sit here in the golden glow of the setting sun. I finally understand that some stories are not meant to be buried, no matter how hard the world tries to hide them. This blanket, once a silent witness to a cold-blooded betrayal, is now a testament to a grandmother's love and the unbreakable power of the truth. Caden is gone, but his spirit lives on in every laugh that escapes Mila's lips, and every time I look into her eyes, I see the justice we fought so hard to win. Thank you for listening to my story and for walking this long, emotional road with me. If there is one thing I have learned at 69, it is that the truth may take its time, but it always finds its way home. Please, cherish your loved ones, hold your secrets close to the light, and remember that even the smallest thread can unravel the biggest lie. Good night, and may you always find peace in the truth.